Scene 5 opens with Blanche writing to Shep Huntley, and I think it's significant again that she's writing towards him, giving this idea perhaps that Shep Huntley is a literary character, in the sense that Shep Huntley is based on that Southern Gothic tradition. He's not a real character, we never see him on stage, and Williams perhaps suggests that he doesn't really belong in this new world. He belongs in Blanche's mind, you know, and Blanche's reminiscences of the past, which is very much based on the literature that she's read. In stark contrast to that, towards the bottom of page 49, we get Steve and Eunice rowing, and that's played for laughs. You know, Eunice is shouting about Steve with the blonde. But actually, I think this is quite a poignant scene. Right towards the top of page 50, Eunice shrieks, "You hit me, I'm going to call the police." And then Stella says, no, she's coming downstairs. Remember in scene 3, Stanley hits Stella, and then Stella comes down the stairs. So there's a real echo here between Steve and Eunice and Stella and Stanley. We get lots of references to how these two characters, or these two couples, are quite similar. And it perhaps sets up this idea of New Orleans being a big cycle, that Stella and Stanley will become Steve and Eunice, and actually perhaps Blanche is better off for getting out of the way. We go on page 50 towards the bottom, Stella asking has she got the police, Stanley no, she's getting a drink, Stella that's more practical. The audience is encouraged to laugh and actually see Stella as somebody who sort of sees the truth and is quite no nonsense, as opposed to Blanche. By the end of the play, I think we feel slightly different about Stella's flippant nature, because it's that same flippant nature that allows her to go on living with Stanley, even though he has raped her sister. Blanche, halfway down page 51, makes a point about Stanley. Now that you're out of the army, you make up for it by treating inanimate objects with such a fury. And William seems to be making a point here about the effect of World War II and the creation of this sort of masculine culture where these men have been honoured as heroes for going and fighting, and yet now there's sort of nothing for them to do. And actually this world of objects, of consumerism, is just a bit of an outlet for this kind of masculine character. We get the interplay between Blanche and Stanley, where Blanche says that she's Virgo, which is the Virgin. But I think even more significant is the fact that Stanley is Capricorn. He is, as Blanche says, the goat. Later in the play, Steve is described as being goat-like. So that parallel between Steve and Eunice and Stella and Stanley is continued. And it's continued even more to about halfway down page 52, where Steve and Eunice emerge together. Steve's arm is around Eunice's shoulder and she is sobbing luxuriously. At the end of the play, Stella is sobbing luxuriously. Steve is cooing love words. At the end of the play, Stanley is cooing love words to Stella. So we get this real echo between them, this idea of New Orleans being one big cycle, and actually in some ways perhaps Blanche is better off for leaving. We get that idea on page 53, about a third of the way down. Blanche is talking about how her string of love has actually been a form of escape for her. She says, I'd put on soft colours, the colours of butterfly wings, and glow, make a little temporary magic just in order to pay for one night's shelter. There's a lot of theatrical references there, you know, the putting on of colours, the glowing of the lights. It's very, very theatrical. And again, Williams seems to align himself and his use of plastic theatre with Blanche. Williams doesn't tell us the truth, he tells us what ought to be the truth, just like Blanche does exactly the same thing. Halfway down page 53, Blanche says, and you've got to have your existence admitted by someone if you're going to have someone's protection. And I think we get this idea again here that Blanche needs that validation, and obviously by watching the play, perhaps Williams is implying that we're giving it to her. On to page 54, we get the moment about 2/3 of the way down where Blanche spills Coke on a dress, and we get Blanche giving a piercing cry. Seems quite melodramatic on first viewing, but then knowing how the play ends with Blanche being raped, I think this could foreshadow it just as much as Stanley and the meat. And in some ways I think it's a better image to show it, because what we get is Coca-Cola, this big American company, this image of American consumerism, staying in Blanche's white dress, you know, the white being the image of purity and the Old South. So it's a great image for what's happening in America, and a great image for Blanche's dreams being tarnished by the harsh reality. About a third of the way down page 55, Stella asks Blanche about Mitch. Blanche, do you want him? And Blanche says, I want to rest. So actually Mitch for Blanche is set up to represent some kind of sanctuary. This adds to the idea of Blanche being in some kind of purgatory throughout the play and needing that kind of final resting place that Mitch represents. Now obviously that's not what she gets, but I think Williams wants us to see the ending as being perhaps slightly positive, in the sense that Blanche does escape this circle of you know, the brutal life in New Orleans. Blanche says, for example, if it happens, I can leave here and not be anyone's problem. Well, that is the end of Streetcar. You know, she literally leaves the stage. Stella and Stanley are left on it. So by leaving the stage, we get the idea perhaps that she has sort of metaphorically died, but actually also ascended and left this purgatory. Stella says to her 2/3 of the way down page 55, it will happen, and Blanche says doubtfully, it will. Again, you know, you could maybe suggest that Williams is building our hopes up to then dash them, but another way of looking at it is that actually there is a certainty to this, that actually through leaving on the doctor's arm this image of a southern gentleman, Blanche has actually seen that through madness she can escape this world. You know, when the hopes of Mitch being this perfect southern gentleman are dashed, that madness is the thing that she chooses. We then get this bizarre scene with Blanche flirting with the young man. We get slightly uncomfortable lines like halfway down page 57, you make my mouth water. Blanche almost seems quite predatory in the way that Stanley is here, but I think her next line when she says young man, young man, is quite telling. It's inviting the audience to recognise just how young this guy is by repeating that word over and over again. But I think also inviting the audience to accept that Blanche also knows this, and actually what she's after is the youth. It not because she's sexually attracted to him, but because of what he represents. You know, this is the idea of first love that Blanche is trying to get back to. This idea of someone who hasn't yet been tainted by life in New Orleans, who could be an Alan Gray or could be a Shep Huntley figure. Mitch then comes in carrying a bunch of roses, so you know, this slightly over-the-top gesture of old-fashioned romance. And Blanche says, look who's coming, my Rose and Cavalier. Quite a sad reference here, because the Rose and Cavalier is an opera, so something that Mitch would have no idea about probably. But in the Rose and Cavalier, an older woman has to give up a younger lover because she accepts it is not the right thing. So it's actually quite telling based on the scene that Blanche has just had. You could argue there's a bit of self-awareness there in Blanche, knowing that actually she's never going to recapture this youth really. She says at the end, ah, merci. It's quite theatrical, you know, quite over the top, quite melodramatic. But also the French, I think, reminds us of Blanche's, you know, sophistication. Dubois, after all, is a French name. You know, that she's probably descended from, French sophisticated plantation owners, which Williams has a very complicated, you know, relationship with, knowing that slavery was very flawed and caused all sorts of problems, but also showing Blanche's very rose-tinted view of that being really positive. And I think on the French note, there's a nice point to make about Belle Reve itself. So Belle Reve isn't actually grammatically correct. The grammatically correct version would be Beau Rêve, yeah, so beautiful dream. Beau Rêve would be the correct version. It's actually Belle Reve, and one theory here is that perhaps the name originally was Belle Reve, spelled R-I-V-E, which means beautiful shore. That is grammatically correct in French, and that over time the name's been corrupted to Belle Reve, R-E-V-E, which means beautiful dream. You could argue that that's a sign of the corruption and the declining power of the Old South and the declining power of these old French families. A more positive view is that this represents Blanche's journey in the play. She leaves the real world behind and goes off into a dream world, and for her, that's her way of recapturing this Southern Gothic glory that she dreams of. And I think that's an interpretation that I perhaps prefer to have.